and has this formula, which is flat and then vertical. And these points are exactly the 60s and the last period. Again, these are the 60 and the last period. Okay, so the purple points. Okay, so so that's the evidence. So there is evidence for this nonlinear curve, and the evidence we found is a relation between inflation and theta, which is an indicator of the labor market tightness. Now we provide a theory of that. So we're going to have a model in which, so this is an interesting model. It's in this search literature, and we don't know much about that. So, but that's what we do here. In some way, we have a model in which labor force participation becomes endogenous. So the agents in the economy decide to consume, and how many people of the household are going to participate to the labor force, okay? So instead of having employment, how much people want to work is how many people want to participate to the labor force. So basically, there is a disutility of working, of participating, which is, this F, and there is a measure of people from 0 to big F that can participate. So if you integrate that term is nothing more than Ft at some power, which is exactly the variable that you're going to choose. So the household is going to decide the labor force participation in this model. But as in model in which there are friction in the labor market, not all the labor force is going to be employed because of those friction. Okay, so there are, some employed NT and unemployed. This is going to be at the end of the day. So we make a simple assumption here. So we say, the labor force comes unattached into the period, but then a fraction, 1 minus S, is going to work. And the other fraction is going to surge. This is simplifying a lot the model. So there is no dynamic in this labor decision, which is a very great simplification for analysis. So SFT is going to be the people which are unemployed and they're looking for a job at the beginning of the period. And how they look for the job? Well, there is a matching function, which depends on the vacancy, on unemployed people looking for a job. And the standard parameters of the literature, the M is the efficiency of the matching, and eta is the elasticity, of the matching. What is theta in the model? Vacancy to unemployed. So that's what is in the data. So basically, this is telling you the probability that you get a job. So HT is the number of people that are going to be hired with respect to the unemployed people. That's giving you the probability of getting a job. And the probability of getting a job is a positive function of theta. Okay, so at the end of the day, employed people are going to be the ones that are attached. They start to be working, 1 minus SFT of the labor force. SFT, which are the ones searching, times the probability of getting a job. Okay? So we're going to make an assumption that the people that are getting a job through the search procedure, they are going to pay a fee for getting this job to an agency, the employment agency. For this reason, so the labor force participation is a function of the real wage, the labor market tightness, and you see here this fee that you pay, okay? But where it comes from? Well, it comes from maximization of the utility under the budget constraints, okay? So that's basically the household deciding how much people are going to be in the labor force. So there are two other elements important in this goods labor market model. So there are, first, household deciding how many they're going to participate to the labor force. Then there are the firms, which are going to somewhere choose how many people to employ, right? And there, we're going to have a model of monopolistic competition as in Rothenberg, which is going to give a standard aggregate supply equation in which inflation is a function of the real wage, of the employment of the firms, and other factor, productivity and inflation. Okay, so I'm not going to detail much that because it's quite known. The other important feature of the model and the novelty here is this employment agency. So basically, this is the agency that decides how many vacancies to post. Okay? So basically, they have to create a vacancy, they have to spend some resources. And you see gamma C times VT. So that's the cost of creating vacancies. And then they get revenue from where? From the workers, which they were paying this fee, gamma B. So the revenue of the employment agency are gamma B times the salary of the worker and the number of matches, okay? So for every matches, you get the fee on the wage. The employment agency is subject to this matching function. So given the vacancy, this is going to produce how many matches there are for given unemployed people there. Plus, there is going to be a bound that we add here. And I'm going to explain why. So basically, the employment agency is not willing to create too many matches because creating too many vacancies if there is no firm that is going to hire. Okay, so they're basically bounded by the number of hires that the firms want to make. Because if I create more vacancies, this is going to be costly for me if the firm is not going to hire. So that's a bound to the firms, to the employment agency problem. So what's happening here? So when we substitute the matching function and use the definition of theta, we can see that the problem of the agency is basically to maximize this revenue, these profits, under the constraints of not creating too many vacancies. So when the constraint is not binding, this is basically telling us what is the flexible wage. Okay? Now, this is important because in this literature, wages are usually indeterminate. So there is this classical indeterminacy problem in the search and matching literature. Here, in some way, we solve it with this employment agency problem by letting this agency to choose basically the vacancy. So at optimum, as if this optimal vacancy rate is going to determine the relation between wages and theta. So now, this is very important here. The relation is positive. So the higher is theta, the higher is going to be the wage. Okay? So this is when the constraint is not binding. But when the constraint is binding, is when we are assuming that the wage are set by the workers, not to be below some norm. Okay? So here we use the Keynesian tradition in which there are downward wage rigidity. Okay? So in that case, the market becomes constrained by the wage to be too high with respect to the flexible wages. So firms don't want to hire many workers because wages are too high. So the employment agency doesn't post too much vacancy, so it's the bound, okay? So as if this problem is no longer relevant for wages, what is going to be relevant for wages is going to be the wage norm, okay? So basically out of here, we get a wage equation, which is two-sided. And this is going to be key to explain the two sides of the Phillips curve. On one side, the wage equation react to theta. On the other side is going to be very Keynesian, okay? So we're going to make an assumption saying when theta is greater than 1, then you are in this flexible world in which wages are very reactive to theta. When there are instead less people, more people searching for jobs than there are job vacancies. So when theta is less than 1, then wages are set according to this norm. So what is this? Wages go backward. They depend on the past. They depend on expectation or inflation. There is some anchoring through the delta. And they can depend on the flexible wage. So there is this component, which is a bit more neoclassical, as in the previous model, I would say. So you can see that when lambda is equal to 1 and delta is equal to 0, you have the wage norm of Keynes in which wages don't go below the previous level in nominal terms, okay? So our wage norm is a bit more sophisticated. It depends on inflation expectation, which can be an important factor in the 70s. And it can also depend on the flexible wage, which is a sort of shadow wage, which is binding, which is not achievable when there is the wage norm. So basically, our model is based on this wage schedule, which is the flexible wage when theta is greater than 1, which is the wage norm when theta is less than 1, okay? So how do we get the inverse Phillips curve I showed you before? Basically, we combine the aggregate supply equation. You can see there is a standard aggregate supply equation in which inflation depends on wages and unemployment. Actually, there is also an employment there. I didn't put it. And then we have the wage equation in which wages depend on theta and on the wage norm. So when we combine this equation, we get the inverse aggregate supply equation, in which inflation is a function of theta under both branches, but in the tight labor market, these kappa parameters are going to be higher. And also this parameter is going to be higher. So supply shock matter more under tight labor market. Under the loose labor market, there is some inertia coming from past wages, and the curve is going to be flatter, okay? So that's basically sort of providing the theory, as I was saying, that corroborates what we found in the data. So let me conclude. Yeah, that's exactly, sorry. So this is exactly this equation when we, the component between inflation and theta, right? So the relation between inflation and theta when we use the data. Our analysis, our estimation. So basically, you can see that the relation is pretty flat. And when log of theta is above 0, so theta is above 1, it's steepest. And there you can see that further, it steeps a lot. So nowadays, theta in the US should be something like this, maybe. So you can see this is creating pressure on inflation. Now, there is something interesting which is coming from our estimation. So our estimation tells us a bit what could be a non-inflationary level of theta. And that's pretty low, it's around 0.5, and in logs it's obviously negative. All right, so policy analysis, what we can learn from this model and this empirical analysis. Well, here we have the inflation and output trade-off. We don't put it in terms of theta because there were some complications that were making the analysis maybe less clean. So it's easier to put them in terms of inflation and output using our model. So you can see that our model gives you the blue line, which is the inverse New Keynesian Phillips curve. And there is an aggregate demand equation. Now, what happened in the 70s? Well, there is a supply shock, oil shock. So this push up the blue line. Now, the second effect is when inflation expectation rise, this is also pushing up the blue line, okay? So basically, we were on the flat part of the curve, so theta below 1. So inflation goes up because of supply movements, which are the supply shock and inflation expectation. Now, this creates some movement in aggregate demand because the real rate falls for some monetary policy. So this is creating expansion, little expansion in aggregate demand, okay? But the overall effect is, you see, not much effect on output, but a lot of inflation. Those are the shocks there. And the evidence was exactly that the 70s, I think I want to go back to this because I didn't stress. And I think it's important. So when you look at this graph, you don't see observation in the 70s and in the period of the Greenspan, before financial crisis, in which theta is greater than 1, okay? So you are always on this loose labor market, okay? So what is our instead view of the recent inflationary surge? Again, the blue line is the aggregate supply equation of our model and our empirical analysis. Is flat and then steep. So inflation expectation didn't move. It's true that there was a supply shock, so it should shift up. But basically, what we believe was also important here is that the aggregate demand shifted a lot, given the monetary and fiscal policy expansion, in such a way that you were on the steep part of the curve, okay? And on the steep part of the curve, you have two things. So any movement in theta is going to create a large movement on inflation here, okay? And movement in the shocks are creating larger movement in inflation too, okay? So it's not just a demand explanation, is the fact that the steep part both amplify the effect of demand and supply shocks. Just to go back, before I conclude, to be persuasive enough, that's the jump of theta, after the COVID. So it goes from 0 to 1.9, 1.84, I think, and then it's going down. So as you see, this is much larger than it was in the Vietnam War, and there is no other episode, in the last 60 years where you find that, okay? So this is an extraordinary pressure on the labor market. So there are people in the US, my co-author was telling, so we started this project, say, how does it come that you find a post in every restaurant, people looking for someone to work and no one working, okay? Right? So, there was so many vacancies. So the market was pretty hot. And, again, these data are large in the Korean War, but not as large as today. And they're extremely large in the War I and II example. Okay, so let me conclude. So what we are suggesting here is that the recent surge in inflation in the US may be caused by the fact that we are on a steep part of this Phillips curve. And going back to Phillips curve, traditional, remember there was this steep part. And there, demand and supply shock creates a lot of action on inflation. So we have provided a theory of this, and the theory is traditionally relying on feature of labor market search models, which allow us to endogenize labor force participation and employment. So that's important. And the second important feature of the model, which you could think is ad hoc, is like we had this wage norm, right? Which is important to create, to exactly create the two branches of the curve. So policy implication, I didn't stress it when I presented the last graph, but so it's easy to go up to create inflation, but then, if you calm down the economy, pushing down aggregate demand, this is not going to produce much of a recession. Okay, so the implication of this being on the steep part of the curve is that you are not going to produce a recession, right? Because if you were on the flat part, it was hard, and that's exactly what happened in the 70s. So in the 70s, you are on the flat part, so you need to, and there was the disanchoring of inflation expectation. So you need to create the Volcker disinflation, very costly for the economy. Now today, we think the episode is different. This is not necessarily creating a recession to reduce inflation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I very much like the paper. But you haven't shown us any evidence about the pattern of wages and possibly the labor income share in the US. And that should fit naturally in your presentation.
Right.
To confirm that that is what has happened. Also, I have another question about how you measure labor market tightness, because if there are flows from people who are not counted as unemployed directly into employment. Okay, so it could be if you just rely on the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, you overestimate the tightness of the labor market. But I think that's a minor comment.
Yeah, no, the wage is well taken, and there is evidence, and we are going to provide also some analysis on the importance of wages on the equation. But the recent paper also of Bernanke and Blanchard, I think they show that wage pressure, they have a two-equation model estimation, which is inflation with respect to theta, the variable we use here, and then theta is a function of wages. And so they get that demand shocks are important. So the pressure on wages theta is also important in their analysis. Now, on the second point, yes, I think you mean, the one important factor is that in the US there has been a drop in labor force participation after the COVID. And so this is a big shock. And this was also part of the, some way, misunderstanding the policymaker had with respect to how much they could put pressure on inflation, because they say pressure on demand, because they say, okay, labor force participation is still low, so we can keep it, we can push it back at the level before the crisis, and that, and so this was in some way misleading, right? So our model is going to tell you also that a shock to labor force market participation is inflationary. So it's a similar effect to theta. It's going to be, it's a similar effect to A theta, and it's a similar effect to a cost push shock. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation and the nice idea to integrate this labor market tightness to the model, which I think my reading of this variable is that it reflects in some way demographic developments that we observe and puts some pressure on the labor market. And I would like to hear from you, what is your interpretation of the drivers behind this labor market tightness? This is the first question, and a related one is that we are still in your model, we are still in a closed economy framework. Did you think about putting it into an open economy framework so that we take also into account the possible effect of globalization tendencies?
Okay. Yeah, regarding demographic and the impact of data, yeah, I will go back. I think, what I see in the data is the times in which this data was very high were also related to the war. And during war period, labor force participation collapsed because people go to military, and military are not considered as part of the labor force. Okay, so those are periods in which there is pressure, right? And after the COVID, there is this pressure. I don't know. I don't think it's much related to demographic in general trend. I think it's a bit more related to shock to labor force participation. Open economy we haven't thought about, and there was a literature on globalization and the effect of that on the slope, right? And there was a literature on the missing disinflation, right? People in the past, the fact is we have been surprised as an economist is that we have been thinking about a flat curve, right? And the globalization forces in those papers are sort of mechanism that implies a flat Phillips curve, right? I think we are focusing a bit on a different channel here, which is the fact that under hot labor market, then the curve becomes steep, and this, well, it's true also that recently, right, there's been a deglobalization phenomenon, right, which could be important, perhaps. Who could, countries that have been a bit more on their national border, right, in terms of many things. So this could have played a role.
Yes, just a question. What does this model have to say about real wages? Because I don't know, at least in Europe, the issue is that you have higher inflation, but you never have real wages keeping up with increasing. I don't know the evidence for the US, and I don't know if.
Well, I was talking before with Lenza, and I think he was telling me something interesting. I didn't know that, in Italy, wage growth is 2%, but in Germany, 6%. So there could be differential, in Europe with respect to where the market is, right? And wage growth has been quite sustained in US too. In the model, real wages on the steep part, they go up with theta, right? So they follow theta.
Yes, just connecting with what we were saying before, and the possible role for deglobalization. So do you think Europe is different, or will you provide possibly the same interpretation also for your
well, I was exactly interested in this data on Germany difference with respect to Italy on wages. So it could be that some regions in Europe are on labor market which is hotter than other regions. But it could be that the supply shock played much more role in Europe. And the other things, I think he was playing a big role at the beginning of the inflation in Europe is the fact that the inflation expectations were a bit more disanchored. So because the ECB delayed too much the reaction. So if you see the data on inflation expectation, they went up even lately more than what it was in the US. So the stronger reaction in US was able to bring down inflation expectation. So at least we see this effect, right? This is an important effect of monetary policy on inflation expectation, which we believe in, this new formulation of Phillips curve, which is not our feature, which is the one coming after the 70s, is that inflation expectation matter. So I think that component, and that component is not necessarily in our model is related to wages, right? And then where we put it into, no, it's related to wages and to the standard. So let me tell you something about here, because I think this is important. So this is the term of inflation expectation that comes from the standard price setting model. So in a sense, if I start to think that inflation is going to be up, then I also start to set my price up, right? And then we saw a lot in Europe, I guess, right? Because you see prices going up and everyone start to adjust. So this mechanism, right? And then there is an additional mechanism here, which is coming from the wage norm. You see the wage norm react to inflation expectation in our model. So these parameters may be higher or lower than beta. So if there is not much reaction of wages to inflation expectation, this is low. But if there is more reaction of wages to that, this is high. So for example, in the 70s, what happened is that you had the supply shock, and then you have a lot of indexation of wages to inflation expectation. And this was creating a lot of importance of this term for inflation. So I guess in US, we convinced here. In Europe, I would say I'm not sure we're there. No, I don't think, and I don't have the data, and we haven't looked at that. But I would be more convinced that we're here on aggregate terms. But now the observation I got today that wages are running 6% in Germany and 2% in Italy might suggest that there are some differential important.
So my question relates to Agnieszka's question. Isn't it possible that labor market tightness will remain with us, and exactly for the reason that because of demographic tendencies and trade? So what I have in mind is basically the idea that Coulthard argues about that China is aging, and we trade with China, so that may create a permanent shock to output and to the labor market, global labor market.
I don't know. I don't see, when I look at this graph, at least for the US, I don't see a trend for that, right? So I see this is more a cyclical variable, right? As it could be unemployment. It's a bit different from that. I don't see that. In a year, I think I didn't point it out, but this is interesting. Look at the Great Depression period. That's exactly a period in which this data is completely low, right? But if you look exactly at this sample, right, you see it's a very cyclical and very much related to the cycle. Okay, it's true, again, going back, that there can be shock, right? And it is a labor force participation shock. There can be other shock that could matter on top of this and can amplify this effect. Yeah. But in the data, I don't see that.
Okay, are there any further? Yes, please go.
Going to the previous slide number 11. Yeah, so what was happening pre-pandemic in 18? Because one could even argue policymakers just overlooked that when COVID hit, we were already on a dangerous trajectory.
Right.
And that was just a, break.
Yeah.
And we just kept going, plus, of course, supercharged by, the stimulus checks that were given to anybody, like monetary policy that was inappropriate, so they have to say for the situation. And then the follow-up is, what do you consider appropriate monetary policy in the next 2 years?
So the first, yes, it's true that you can see before the pandemic a rise in data But this didn't create much pressure on inflation. Our choice, actually, the weakness, there can be many weak parts of this paper, but one we are very aware is the fact that we believe this theta is equal to 1 is an important discriminant, right? But we don't have a theory for that. Okay? So, for example, I was looking at UK data and Canada. Labor market is tight now, but theta is around 1. So perhaps, this theta is something that can be different for countries, that it can be different for different periods. Actually, we can have in the model some way to retrieve an endogenous weight theta, okay, the discriminant. So there it could be, it was not that much high, or it didn't go further. Now, so it could be that the steepness come later. This we don't know, right? But it seems that theta is equal to 1 is a good representation of it. Now, the second question, what policy would do? Well, I guess there are lessons that we can draw from this equation and from, in general, the standard analysis. Is like, I think one important thing. Yeah, let me go back to this graph. I think it's important. So this is CPI inflation for US, and this is the 60. So the blue line are inflation expectation. So you see, inflation goes up, then you start to have tightening of policy. But then you see you are not bringing inflation down. And inflation expectation remains still high, okay? So when you have a shock, then you get the oil shock, then you are completely in trouble. So the lesson is you shouldn't be, you should remain tight for some times in a way to bring inflation down soon. And I don't think that could be so soon for the inflation 2% target. But to do that, you need to be really, what the market didn't basically understand, right? The market, even today, right? The market reacted very positively to the fact that inflation is going down in the US, although core is high, but the CPI index is a bit showing this inflation. So the market does, takes this as a signal that the Fed is going to pause and eventually, reduce interest rates. But we have seen that this didn't happen. So central bank will try to be on hold for some times once they see real inflation going toward the target, okay? But having core inflation to 5% as it is today is not a success, right? You see inflation going down. And the risk is exactly this, that you can get an unfavorable shock. And then you can get the disanchoring, especially because you didn't bring down inflation much, right? And if you get the disanchoring inflation expectation, then it becomes very costly to bring inflation down. So the risk, the big risk is that of, and I think people are surprised about the persistence of inflation. But it's not a surprise, right? Given our models, right?
Okay, there is one last question online. Oliver Landman, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you very much. This is Oliver Landman, University of Freiburg, Germany. May I briefly come back to the issue of the role of wages? You mentioned the Blanchard-Bernanke paper as being largely in line with yours, but as I read their paper, they find very little role for labor market tightness and wages, and rather see a larger impact on inflation from the demand side via the channel the goods market directly, shortages on the goods market popping up. Do you see that as a contradiction, or could you comment on how your analysis relates to theirs? Thank you.
Well, I think if I read it well, they were emphasizing the supply shock as an important in the beginning of the pickup of inflation, and that they were saying that the demand shock through the data was kicking in later and being more persistent, having more persistent effect on inflation. So if this was my reading, but perhaps I'm missing something. So, but my reading was that it was not contradictory to us. In a sense, in our work, we emphasize, even in the writing, and I think we need to change, and also we will have an estimation actually in which we are going to address this. We emphasize demand, but there is also our model as implication for supply shock. In a sense, if you are on the steep part, those are have more effect. And we have a regression in which we put a dummy. So actually, the proper estimation would have to have a dummy for theta and a dummy for the supply shock there too. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to end here. It's already 6:08. So thanks very much once again for this excellent presentation and for the discussion afterwards. So
thank you very much.
Yes, so we will have our dinner. It's actually going to be a barbecue, as I understood it, at 7 on the rooftop of this building. So I hope to see you all over there. Just another short thing. Someone left a suitcase in one of the other 3 rooms, the parallel session room. So, okay, that's excellent. So that's solved. Good. So see you this evening.
Yeah, just concerning direction. So there will be a meeting at 6:45, just at the registration desk, or you can just go by yourself to the roof garden. And then there are 2 lifters if you go back to the coffee break area, you see on both sides of the buildings 2 pairs of lifter, and go to the last floor. It's floor J. Okay. I think that's it.